Jesus Christ, you actually wore that? Did you get lost on your way to the soup kitchen? The insult didn't whisper. It detonated. 100 heads turned inside the Skyline Tower Ballroom, New York's most exclusive gala where billionaires toast themselves beneath chandeliers worth more than small countries. Laughter froze. Glasses hovered midair. At the center of the silence, two women. Madison Steele, 28, the golden prodigy of Wall Street, rich, reckless, desperate to prove she runs the room. Evelyn Carter, 52, the quiet CEO of Carter Holdings, older, composed, invisible only to those too arrogant to see power when it sits still. Madison stood glittering in gold, drunk on attention. Evelyn sat alone in indigo silk, calm as deep water. One woman believed she was delivering the kill shot. The other was calculating the fallout. Around them, the elite leaned closer, sensing blood, mistaking cruelty for entertainment. What no one realized was this. The woman they were laughing at built the foundations of their fortunes. And before the night was over, she would remind every one of them exactly whose name was carved beneath their empire. The reaction was immediate, predatory. A hedge fund manager from Wall Street, his tie loosened and his scotch glass already half drained, grinned into the amber liquid. "Looks like the charity case snuck in with a real ticket this year," he muttered, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. His words slithered through the air, emboldening others. At a nearby table, a woman whose fingers glittered with blood diamonds leaned toward her companion. "That dress," she whispered, her voice dripping contempt, "is a fireable offense." A fashion influencer with lips inflated to cartoon proportions chimed in with theatrical disgust. "It's sincere." She spat the word like a profanity, and laughter rippled outward, brittle and cruel. The ballroom had shifted. No longer a place of elegance, it had become a coliseum. The lions were circling, teeth bared, waiting for the first drop of blood. But Evelyn Carter did not flinch. She blinked once, slowly, as though filing the insults away into a vast archive. This tone was not new. She had heard it at 22, when a venture capitalist in Boston had told her that her software pitch was cute, but better left to men. She had heard it at 35, when a board dismissed her billion-dollar acquisition plan, only to applaud 6 months later when a male colleague presented the same idea. And now, here again, the same sneer, the same attempt to erase her existence with a single line of ridicule. Across the room, unseen by most, Jordan Reyes steadied her clutch bag, angling her phone's hidden camera lens through a tiny slit in the fabric. Her pulse quickened as she whispered into her voice recorder, "Public humiliation disguised as wit. This isn't gossip. This is cultural violence." At another table, Richard Hollingsworth, the Boston private equity magnate, watched with a composure that was almost unnerving. He leaned toward his wife, his voice a low rumble. "They mistake serenity for weakness. They don't realize they're baiting a sleeping giant." The laughter continued, cruel and infectious. The glittering room was drunk on spectacle. Madison Steele basked in it, golden and brash, convinced she was untouchable. But Evelyn Carter remained a quiet pillar in indigo, unmoved, unshaken. The Colosseum roared, the lions circled, and still she sat perfectly still, waiting. The ballroom's laughter rolled like a tide, but Evelyn Carter sat rooted in stillness, her hand resting lightly on the stem of her glass. To most, she appeared passive, even diminished, yet within her, the silence was not surrender. It was discipline. It was memory. At 22, she had walked into her first venture pitch in Boston with nothing but a prototype, a deck of slides, and conviction that her ideas could alter the future of logistics. The men at the table, gray suits, polished shoes, cigars that left the boardroom smelling of arrogance, had smiled with patronizing patience. One leaned back and called her proposal adorable, as if it were a child's science fair project. They dismissed her without hesitation. That night she cried in her dorm apartment, not because she doubted her work, but because she realized they hadn't even listened. At 35, she had sat in another room, larger, richer, the kind with oil paintings and brass fixtures. She had laid out a billion-dollar acquisition strategy, precise down to the decimal. The board had waved her off, saying the numbers were too ambitious. 6 months later, a man, less prepared, less informed, presented the same idea and was hailed as a visionary. She had watched applause echo off those walls while her name never left anyone's lips. Now at 52, inside the gleaming skyline ballroom, the sneers had the same tone, the same dismissal dressed in couture and champagne. But Evelyn Carter had learned something across decades of scars. Patience could be weaponized. Silence could be sharpened into steel. Every insult tonight, every chuckle bouncing off the marble, was being cataloged with the precision of a forensic accountant tallying fraud. Not with anger, not with shame, with cold, disciplined clarity. At Madison Steele's table, another round of laughter broke out. A man in his 30s, a startup founder with too much money and too little maturity, clinked his glass loudly. Here's to ambition, knowing its place. The crowd chuckled, eager to feed the spectacle. Madison smirked, twirling her stem of red wine like a conductor's baton. Evelyn blinked once, her eyes steady. She remembered the vow she had whispered to herself years ago after yet another boardroom slammed the door in her face. I will not shout for space in rooms built to silence me. I will build the kind of power that makes the rooms irrelevant. Her silence tonight was not absence. It was presence. It was strategy. And it was about to become very, very dangerous. Madison Steele, glittering under the chandelier light, leaned back in her chair, savoring the hush that followed her latest barb. But silence from her opponent was not enough. She craved spectacle. She needed the room to know, to feel that she was in control. Rising gracefully, she let her gold dress catch every spotlight as she stepped closer to Evelyn Carter's solitary table. Her heels clicked like a gavel striking marble, each step designed to claim territory. The crowd turned their heads, half with amusement, half with unease, but none willing to look away. Madison's crimson lips curved into a smile as sharp as glass. You know, she said loudly, ensuring her words carried across the ballroom, I was told this event was exclusive, but judging by tonight's guest list, she trailed off deliberately, pivoting so the crowd could see her profile. Perhaps security has gotten a little sloppy. Ripples of laughter broke out, heads craned more openly now. Whispers darted like knives. She's not on the list. She doesn't belong here. Who let her in? The phrase was more than gossip. It was a sentence. In rooms like this, not being on the list was social execution. It meant you weren't part of the club. You weren't sanctioned. You weren't worthy. Evelyn Carter remained motionless, her indigo gown pooling around her chair like midnight silk, her gaze fixed not on Madison, but on the flickering flame of a small candle at the center of her table. Her stillness deepened, an unshakable line of grace that only widened the gulf between her and the predatory crowd. But Madison wasn't finished. She theatrically turned to her table of sycophants, raising her voice once more. Maybe someone should check her credentials. After all, she let the pause hang, savoring it. This is New York, not a soup kitchen. Not everyone gets a seat at this table. The laughter this time was sharper, emboldened by her audacity. A few even clapped. The words simple but loaded branded Evelyn an interloper, a fraud, an uninvited guest in a room obsessed with exclusivity. From the corner, Jordan Reyes whispered into her recorder, her pulse racing. Not on the list. This isn't banter anymore. This is erasure dressed up as entertainment. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth adjusted his cufflinks, his face unreadable. To his wife, he murmured, They don't realize, every word, every laugh, it's evidence she's banking. The Coliseum roared its approval, blind to the trap it was helping Madison Steele build. And Evelyn Carter, silent as stone, simply let it happen. The ballroom buzzed with cruel energy, laughter rising and falling like waves against the walls of glass that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. Madison Steele basked in it, golden and radiant, convinced every eye that lingered was proof of her dominance. But in the shadows of that glittering cruelty, two observers were watching with very different eyes. At the edge of the room, Jordan Reyes steadied her clutch against her hip. Inside, the concealed lens of her phone camera blinked red, recording every smirk, every insult, every sip of champagne laced with mockery. She kept her face blank, her body angled like she was just another anonymous guest. But her fingers trembled slightly as she tapped notes into her phone, High-tech lynching, ritual humiliation, black woman as target, document everything. For Jordan, this wasn't just a scandal for tomorrow's gossip columns. This was history being written in real time. A cultural autopsy under chandeliers and champagne. Across the ballroom, Richard Hollingsworth leaned back in his chair, his whiskey untouched. His reputation in Boston was one of ruthless calculation, a man who could strip a company down to its bones and sell the marrow at a profit. Yet now his gray eyes were locked on Evelyn Carter, studying her like a chess master studying an opponent's opening gambit. He spoke softly to his wife. The words meant only for her. They think her silence is weakness. They don't understand. Every insult she absorbs is a piece on the board. She's not ignoring the attack. She's letting Madison build her own noose. His wife frowned, following his gaze toward the indigo figure at the solitary table. Evelyn had not moved, had not spoken, but her stillness carried weight, as if the entire ballroom were unknowingly pivoting around her gravity. Madison, oblivious, mistook that silence for victory. She tossed her platinum hair, laughing as her friends clapped weakly. "You see? Not even a word." "I suppose some people know their place after all," Jordan typed quickly, heart pounding. "Not silence, control, a pressure chamber. The longer she waits, the heavier it becomes." Richard adjusted his cufflinks again, a glint of anticipation flickering across his otherwise impassive face. "This room thinks they're watching her unravel," he murmured, "but what they're really watching is her calculation, and when she moves, the fallout will be catastrophic." In a ballroom of 100 voices, it was the quiet watchers, the journalist with a hidden lens, and the financier with a memory for power, that understood the truth. The storm was gathering, and Madison Steele was still laughing. Madison Steele circled closer to Evelyn Carter's table, each step deliberate, her golden dress glinting like molten sunlight under the chandeliers. The crowd leaned in, the cruel curiosity of spectators at a prize fight. She was intoxicated by their attention, every smirk and every whispered chuckle feeding her hunger. When she stopped, just a few feet away from Evelyn, she tilted her head with mock sweetness. Her wine glass caught the light, a deep scarlet swirl within crystal. Then, with her voice pitched to carry across the ballroom, she delivered her next blow. "Sweetheart," Madison purred, pointing one manicured finger toward the back of the room. "If you're lost, the service entrance is that way." The words detonated. A sharp, ugly laugh erupted from a hedge fund manager, and another guest clapped once, too loudly before realizing the room's laughter was a little too jagged, a little too cruel. For many, the insult landed like a dagger wrapped in silk, deliberate, surgical, impossible to misinterpret. Evelyn Carter was being told she belonged not among them, but in the shadows carrying trays, invisible except to serve. Evelyn's hand, steady on her water glass, did not tremble. Her shoulders remained straight, her eyes fixed on the candlelight before her. Yet inside, her memory called back another night, decades earlier. She was 20 years old, standing in the rain outside a Harvard gala, dressed in her one decent gown, shivering as a doorman sneered, "This is a private event, not for people like you." The sting of humiliation had burned hot that night. She had walked home soaked and silent, whispering a vow into the cold air. "One day I will own the rooms they try to throw me out of." Now, years later, here she sat. Same sneer, different face. The stakes had only grown higher. But Evelyn Carter was no longer the girl shivering outside the door. She was the architect of empires, the unseen hand on levers of capital, the quiet power seated calmly as ignorance crowned itself queen. Madison's friends tittered, emboldened. A woman dripping in diamonds leaned forward with a grin. "Perfect dress for carrying hors d'oeuvres," she said, and laughter broke again, brittle and ugly. Across the room, Jordan Reyes clenched her jaw, whispering into her recorder, "Service entrance. Explicit. She's reducing her to labor, to nothing. This is deliberate humiliation, not banter." Richard Hollingsworth exhaled slowly, his eyes still locked on Evelyn. "They think they've pushed her into silence," he muttered. "But what they've done is set the stage. She won't need to raise her voice. When she moves, the ground under Madison's feet will collapse." Evelyn lifted her glass, took one quiet sip, and set it down again with absolute precision. Not a drop spilled, not a sound echoed. The lions roared, but the woman in indigo was no prey. She was patience incarnate, waiting for the moment when silence would turn into a blade. Madison Steele's laughter rang out, shrill and triumphant, bouncing off the marble columns of the Skyline Tower ballroom. She had tasted the crowd's approval and wanted more. Silence from Evelyn Carter was not enough. It unnerved her, yes, but it also tempted her to escalate, to force a reaction. She leaned in closer, golden fabric stretched tight across her frame, the stem of her wine glass spinning slowly between her fingers. The deep red liquid inside glinted dangerously, a dark mirror to her intentions. The room's hum dimmed, anticipation rippling outward like the intake of a collective breath. And then, with a tilt of her wrist disguised as clumsy accident, she did it. The wine spilled forward in a deliberate cascade, a slow ribbon of crimson that splashed across Evelyn's indigo gown. The liquid spread in dark blooms, soaking into the fabric, staining it like blood blooming on the ocean's surface. A gasp tore through the ballroom. A woman at the next table covered her mouth, horrified. A man muttered, "Dear God, she actually did it." Another let out a nervous, broken laugh, unable to decide whether this was still entertainment or something far darker. Madison straightened, feigning innocence, her free hand flying theatrically to her chest. "Oh my," she chirped, her tone dripping with mockery. "How terribly clumsy of me. I do hope dry cleaning isn't too expensive on your salary." The laughter that followed was fractured, uneasy. Some chuckled because they had been trained to side with power, others because they didn't know what else to do. But the undercurrent of the room had changed. The cruelty had shifted from words to assault, from spectacle to violation. A line had been crossed. Evelyn Carter did not rise, did not recoil. She simply looked down at the spreading stain, then back up at Madison with an expression of absolute calm. Her breathing was steady, her face unshaken. The stain on her gown was no humiliation. It was evidence. From her corner, Jordan Reyes nearly tore through her notepad with the force of her pen. Wine poured, intentional, on film, documented. Her hidden camera blinked steadily, capturing every cruel angle, every sneer. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth whispered grimly to his wife, "This isn't humiliation. This is self-immolation. She has no idea what she's just ignited." Madison, basking in what she thought was triumph, twirled her glass again, smirking. "You know," she sneered, her voice echoing, "I think red is a much better color on you." But the laughter that followed was thin, hollow. The crowd no longer looked only at Evelyn with disdain. They looked at Madison too, with the first hints of dread. The wine stain glistened beneath the chandeliers like a wound, or a warning. And Evelyn Carter, still silent, marked the moment in her mind like a line of testimony in a trial. The evidence was mounting. The ballroom was no longer laughing with ease. What had once been sharp amusement now thinned into a jagged, uncomfortable silence. The wine stain on Evelyn Carter's gown shimmered under the chandeliers, dark and accusing, like an open wound every eye was forced to acknowledge. Glances darted between guests. Some shifted in their chairs, others adjusted their jewelry or stared into their glasses as if hoping the bubbles might erase what they had just witnessed. The cruelty that had moments earlier passed as sport now felt like complicity. One waiter, balancing a tray of champagne flutes, froze mid-step, his eyes flicking between Madison Steele and Evelyn Carter. He swallowed hard, uncertain whether to continue serving or to back away. The mask of invisibility demanded of staff at events like this had slipped. Even the servers felt the fracture in the air. Evelyn sat motionless, her hands folded neatly over the napkin she had placed across her lap. Her serenity was unbearable now, too heavy, too deliberate. The silence radiating from her was no longer mistaken for submission. It was beginning to feel like judgment. Madison, sensing the shift but blind to its true cause, pressed harder. She lifted her chin, smiled thinly, and announced, "Well, accidents do happen, don't they?" Her voice was light, but it carried the brittle ring of desperation. The laughter that followed was different now, scattered, forced, guilty. A few chuckles died halfway into the throat. Even Madison's closest allies seemed reluctant to echo her cruelty. At her table in the corner, Jordan Reyes pressed record again on her hidden camera, whispering into her sleeve. Atmosphere changed. From spectacle to crime scene. The stain is no longer humiliation. It's evidence. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth adjusted his posture, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the tremor in the crowd, the subtle pivot of sentiment. He had seen it before in markets and boardrooms. The instant when greed turned to fear, when loyalty crumbled and allies fled. The tide is turning, he murmured. They just don't know it yet. The jazz band continued to play, professional and oblivious, their bright notes clashing with the suffocating heaviness that now gripped the room. No one was listening. The real performance was the silence pressing in from Evelyn Carter's corner. The mood had shifted irrevocably. Madison Steele thought she still owned the stage, but the audience was already beginning to doubt their star. Madison Steele wasn't satisfied. The laughter was no longer hers to command. The smiles around her had thinned, and even her friends' applause felt perfunctory. The wine stain hadn't humiliated Evelyn Carter the way she had hoped. Evelyn's silence, that unyielding poise, was bending the atmosphere against her. So Madison doubled down. She raised her glass high, her bracelets clinking together like warning bells, and her voice sliced through the ballroom. "Security," she called, feigning outrage. "Would someone please escort this woman out of here? She doesn't belong." The words landed like a gavel. A collective gasp swept across the guests. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others sipped their drinks too quickly, trying to disguise their unease. What had begun as cruel entertainment had now tipped into something darker, something almost dangerous. The glamour of mockery had curdled into the spectacle of expulsion. Near the grand doors, two security guards exchanged wary glances. They were tall, broad-shouldered men in tailored black suits, accustomed to blending into the edges of such events. But Madison Steele was a major donor, and her demand carried weight. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to move through the parting crowd toward Evelyn's solitary table. Madison smirked, her red lips curving with satisfaction. She leaned toward her table mates and spoke just loudly enough for the nearest circle to hear. "Some people just refuse to understand their place. This is New York's Empire Summit Gala, not a shelter." A few of her allies chuckled weakly, their voices tight, as if they knew laughter now came at a cost. Evelyn Carter didn't move. She didn't look at the guards drawing closer, didn't acknowledge the gasps and murmurs that rippled around her. She simply adjusted the linen napkin covering her lap, smoothing it gently over the crimson stain. Her composure was absolute, terrifying in its calm. From her corner, Jordan Reyes whispered into her recorder. "Security called. They're moving in. Madison wants her thrown out. This isn't banter anymore, it's ritual exile. And Evelyn? She hasn't moved a muscle." Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth's eyes sharpened. He leaned toward his wife, his voice low and deliberate. "She's not resisting because she doesn't have to. The moment Madison set this in motion, she guaranteed her own collapse." The crowd held its breath as the guards drew nearer, their polished shoes clicking on marble. The stage was set. Evelyn Carter remained seated, indigo silk flowing around her like a pool of night. Madison Steele smiled as if victory was already hers, but the silence in the room said otherwise. The two guards reached Evelyn Carter's table. They hesitated, looming figures caught in a strange paralysis. On the one hand, Madison Steele was a celebrated donor, her name plastered across billboards and magazine covers. On the other, Evelyn's stillness radiated an authority they couldn't quite name but instinctively respected. "Ma'am," one of them said, voice low and hesitant, "we're going to have to ask you to come with us." The entire ballroom froze. Conversations cut mid-sentence, glasses held half-raised. Dozens of phones were already out, no longer trying to be discreet. The spectacle was now content, live-streamed in whispers and shaky footage. Madison, standing nearby, basked in it, her smirk widening like a child, certain she had won a game. "Yes, darling," she crooned, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Time for you to leave. You don't belong here." For the first time that evening, Evelyn Carter moved with purpose. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the small black clutch at her side. The faint click of its clasp opening seemed to echo off the marble walls. She withdrew her phone, its dark screen glowing to life with a swipe of her thumb. The guard stiffened, uncertain. Madison laughed. Oh, this is Rich. What are you doing? Calling an Uber to take you back downtown? Her friends snickered on cue, but even their laughter sounded hollow, unsure. Evelyn lifted the phone to her ear. Her voice when it came was smooth as silk, yet heavy with command, the kind of tone that cut through noise without needing to rise above it. Dana, she said evenly, initiate Protocol 7. A hush fell so absolute it felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. On the other end, the crisp, efficient voice of Dana Brooks, her COO, answered instantly. At once, Ms. Carter. Steel Innovations bridge loan is on my screen now. The guards froze, hands hovering uselessly at their sides. Madison blinked, her smirk faltering for the first time. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She demanded, but her voice wavered. Across the room, Jordan Reyes's eyes went wide. She scribbled furiously into her notes. Protocol 7. Corporate Doomsday Clause. This isn't theater, it's execution. Richard Hollingsworth sat straighter, recognition flashing in his gaze. He whispered to his wife, his lips curling into the faintest smile. Oh my God, it's real. Protocol 7. I've heard of it but never thought she'd use it in public. The ballroom buzzed with panicked whispers now. The name Carter rippled through the crowd like a dropped match in dry grass. Evelyn Carter. Carter Holdings. She's behind half the real estate in Midtown. She bankrolls Wall Street. Evelyn ended the call with a gentle press of her finger. She lowered the phone back into her clutch, snapped it shut with a sound like a judge's gavel, and finally looked directly at Madison Steele. Her eyes were calm, unblinking, but they carried the weight of a storm breaking over the city. The trap had been sprung. The words Protocol 7 still hung in the air, but it wasn't just the phrase that unsettled the room. It was the name that followed. Carter. At first it was a murmur, fragile and uncertain. Did she say Evelyn Carter? One man whispered, his eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile memory with reality. A woman in sequins leaned toward her date. Carter Holdings? The Carter Holdings? The words spread faster than spilled wine across a white tablecloth. Soon the entire ballroom was alive with anxious whispers. Midtown Towers, her signatures on those contracts. She bankrolls half the banks on Wall Street. She doesn't just belong here. She owns this place. At the head table, William Bradford III, billionaire real estate magnate and host of the Gala, felt a chill ripple through his spine. His surgically tightened face twitched as he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. Evelyn Carter's name was etched onto deals that had made him hundreds of millions. He had signed her contracts, shaken her hand across polished mahogany tables, and yet here he sat, frozen, watching her be treated like an interloper. His throat worked, desperate to form words, but fear and cowardice glued him to his seat. Meanwhile, Madison Steele's painted smile began to crack. She glanced at her friends, seeking affirmation, but found only uncertainty. Her audience, once complicit, was beginning to waver. Some avoided her gaze. Others studied their shoes or checked their phones, pretending they weren't part of the jeering mob only moments ago. Evelyn Carter remained seated, serene as ever, her gaze now lifted from the candlelight to the woman standing before her. Her silence had become unbearable. It was no longer mistaken for weakness. It was being recognized as strength. At her corner table, Jordan Reyes whispered into her recorder, "The tide's turning. They're realizing she isn't invisible. She's infrastructure. They're terrified because they laughed at the wrong woman." And Richard Hollingsworth, unable to suppress the satisfaction in his voice, leaned closer to his wife. "Now they see it," he murmured. "They mocked serenity, and in doing so, they exposed themselves. The room is hers already. Madison just doesn't know she's standing on a collapsing floor." The whispers surged louder, faster, echoing through the glittering ballroom. "Carter, Carter, Carter." And Madison Steele, still clinging to her fading smile, finally felt the first tremor of fear. The murmurs had grown into a current that Madison Steele could no longer control. Her name no longer floated atop the room like gold dust. It drowned beneath the heavy tide of another. Carter. Still seated, Evelyn Carter adjusted the linen napkin across her lap, a deliberate gesture, as if cataloging the insult of spilled wine like a piece of evidence. Then with a slow and fluid grace, she rose. The room shifted with her. Chairs scraped back, not from resistance but from instinct. Guests leaned away, giving her space, as if her indigo gown carried the force of an invisible tide. The stain of crimson across the silk no longer looked like humiliation. It looked like a battle standard. Her eyes found Madison, steady and unblinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost intimate, yet it carried across the ballroom with surgical precision. You just tried to humiliate the woman holding the mortgage on your entire future. The words landed like a hammer dropped onto glass. The silence that followed wasn't passive, it was suffocating, charged, alive. Madison blinked, her jaw tightening, her laugh catching in her throat before it could escape. What? What are you talking about? She demanded. But the edge of doubt was already there, fraying her tone. Phones tilted higher, cameras zoomed in. Guests didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. The spectacle had inverted. No longer Madison commanding the stage, but Evelyn, every syllable anchoring the crowd tighter in her orbit. At her corner, Jordan Reyes nearly stopped breathing, her voice a whisper against the mic of her recorder. First strike landed, calm, lethal, devastating. Madison doesn't realize. This is no longer her performance. It's Evelyn's deposition. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth allowed himself the faintest of nods. There it is, he murmured. The Queen just moved her first piece. Every word from here is checkmate. Madison, standing too close, felt the weight of 1,000 eyes swing back toward her. Her golden dress no longer dazzled. Her glass of wine, once a prop for mockery, now trembled faintly in her grip. And Evelyn Carter, calm and unshaken, hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. The balance of power had shifted with a single sentence. The silence that followed Evelyn Carter's words was heavy, electric. Madison Steele's painted smile faltered under its weight, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for reassurance that no longer existed. Evelyn took a single step forward, her indigo gown gliding across the marble floor. Her voice remained calm, unhurried, each syllable as deliberate as ink drying on parchment. Carter Holdings is financing your $4.9 billion merger, Miss Steele. Without that bridge, your empire collapses before sunrise. A gasp rippled across the ballroom, sharper than the clinking of crystal. Guests looked down at their phones, typing furiously, checking news tickers, hunting for confirmation of what they already knew in their bones. Evelyn did not stop. Her gaze swept across the glittering assembly, pinning each listener like an insect to a board. And it does not end there. Carter Holdings is also the majority stakeholder in the parent company that owns this hotel. Every light above your head, every polished stone beneath your feet, every glass of champagne poured tonight, paid for with capital under my signature. Even this tower itself, Skyline Tower, was built on financing negotiated by my board. The words echoed in the cavernous space, reverberating against marble and glass, until it seemed the building itself acknowledged her claim. Madison tried to interject, her voice brittle. That's impossible. You're bluffing. Evelyn tilted her head ever so slightly, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. Impossible? She repeated softly. Tell me then, when was the last time you signed a contract that didn't carry my name on the other side? The question struck harder than any accusation. Around the room, shoulders stiffened. More than a few guests had indeed inked deals with Carter Holdings, profited off Carter's vast web of capital. They knew she was telling the truth. They had the contracts to prove it. At her corner, Jordan Reyes whispered into her recorder, her voice trembling. She owns the merger. She owns the hotel. She owns the tower. This isn't just a social reveal. This is systemic. The ground Madison is standing on isn't hers. It's Evelyn's. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth's eyes gleamed with recognition. He leaned toward his wife, his voice tinged with awe. She isn't just pulling a card. She's revealing the board. Madison's fighting for applause while Evelyn controls the infrastructure. Madison's hands shook. Her golden dress, moments ago a beacon of arrogance, now looked gaudy, a costume beneath the harsh glare of reality. She opened her mouth to laugh, to sneer, to regain footing, but the sound never came. Because everyone in the ballroom now knew this wasn't Madison's arena. It was Evelyn Carter's house. The chandeliers still blazed overhead, but the warmth they cast no longer felt celebratory. The ballroom was a pressure chamber, every guest straining to hear, to witness, to see what would happen next. Then it came, the sound that would unravel Madison Steele. Her clutch buzzed violently in her hand. Once, twice, then again, an unrelenting tremor. She fumbled with the clasp, her manicured fingers suddenly clumsy. The phone slipped, nearly falling before she caught it, the glow of the screen illuminating her pale face. Dozens of notifications rolled in like a tidal wave. From CFO, urgent, bridge loan revoked. From legal, contract terminated effective immediately. From board chair, need you to call now. Investors are panicking. From Dana Brooks, Carter Holdings COO, forwarded through channels. Wire transfers frozen. Negotiations halted. Madison's eyes widened, her pupils darting across the screen as if she could scroll her empire back into existence. A low guttural sound escaped her throat. A gasp, a choke, a plea all at once. The crowd leaned in, hungry for proof. And there it was, written in cold digital ink for all to see, reflected on her trembling face. The empire of steel innovations was crumbling in real time. Evelyn Carter hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved more than a few graceful steps. Yet here was Madison, undone not by shouting or spectacle, but by the quiet authority of a single phone call and a few lines of text. At her corner, Jordan Reyes whispered breathlessly into her recorder, "It's happening. Notifications pouring in. The deal is dead. Her empire is collapsing in front of 100 witnesses." Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth folded his hands neatly, as though closing the lid on a well-played chess match. "Check," he murmured to his wife. "And soon, mate." Madison's golden dress, shimmering just moments ago, now seemed to sag with her. Her hand shook so violently she had to set her wineglass on the nearest table, where it clinked against the marble with a hollow finality. The crowd saw it. Every guest who had laughed, who had whispered, who had joined in the mockery, now saw what Evelyn Carter had quietly known all along. The performance was over. Madison Steele was finished, and the ballroom knew it. The ballroom held its breath. Madison Steele stood frozen, her phone buzzing uselessly in her trembling hand, her golden dress no longer radiant, but gaudy under the harsh glare of revelation. Around her, the crowd shifted. Some looked away in shame. Others leaned forward, captivated by the slow-motion collapse unfolding before them. Evelyn Carter didn't gloat. She didn't sneer. She simply stepped into the silence she had forged, every movement deliberate, every word a scalpel. Her voice, when it came, was soft and measured, but it sliced through the room with the finality of a verdict. "Respect," she said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned assembly, "is not negotiable. Not now. Not ever." The words landed like thunder, though she had barely raised her voice. Guests stiffened as if personally indicted. Every chuckle they'd given Madison earlier, every complicit smirk, now weighed heavy in their throats. At her table in the corner, Jordan Reyes whispered into her recorder, her hands shaking. "She's doing it, turning humiliation into principle. She's not just dismantling Madison, she's teaching the room." Richard Hollingsworth raised his glass, his voice clear and firm enough for nearby guests to hear. "That," he said with certainty, "is what true leadership looks like." The ripple began. A woman in a sequined gown, who had laughed earlier at Madison's jabs, now lifted her flute in silent salute toward Evelyn. A man in a tailored tuxedo followed. Soon, glasses across the ballroom tilted subtly, a quiet chorus of acknowledgement, a reversal of allegiance as swift as it was complete. Madison's mouth opened as if to argue, to reclaim the stage, but no words came. Her throat worked, but her voice betrayed her. She was mute in the presence of power she couldn't comprehend, much less control. Evelyn Carter turned back to her table, lifting her own glass of still water. She took a slow sip, set it down without spilling a drop, and let the silence thrum like a heartbeat. Respect had been denied her for decades, in boardrooms, in deals, in ballrooms just like this one. But tonight, she had carved it into stone, not by force, not by noise, by truth, by power that didn't ask. It commanded, and every person in that room understood they were standing in the presence of it. The silence in the Skyline Tower ballroom thickened until even the soft jazz from the corner faltered, the musicians' hands trembling on their instruments. Every guest knew they were no longer at a gala. They were inside a courtroom, and the verdict was about to be handed down. Evelyn Carter placed both hands lightly on the back of her chair, her posture regal, her expression serene. When she spoke again, it was not to Madison Steele alone. It was to the room, to New York, to anyone with the power or arrogance to doubt her. As of this moment, she said, her voice carrying like a bell across marble and glass, the $4.9 billion merger between Carter Holdings and Steele Innovations is terminated. Effective immediately, the words crashed over the ballroom like a wave of ice water. Glasses slipped from fingers. A tray of hors d'oeuvres clattered to the floor. Dozens of guests scrambled for their phones, frantically dialing offices, brokers, partners. The glow of screens illuminated horrified faces as Wall Street's nervous system lit up in real time. Madison swayed where she stood, her golden dress trembling with her body. "No, no, you can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking to herself. "You'll ruin me. You'll ruin everything." Evelyn's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I am not ruining you," she replied softly. "You did that the moment you mistook cruelty for strength. I am merely accelerating the collapse." At her corner, Jordan Reyes whispered hoarsely into her recorder, every word breaking with adrenaline. "It's over. She canceled the deal. Publicly. Madison's empire has just died in front of 100 witnesses." Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth sat straighter, his voice carrying now with deliberate clarity. "That," he said, lifting his glass, "is fiduciary duty. That is leadership. That is how empires fall." Others followed. One by one, glasses rose in solemn acknowledgement of what they had witnessed. Not just a social reckoning, but the surgical dismantling of an empire worth billions. Madison clutched her phone, refreshing her inbox with shaking hands, watching a cascade of disaster flood her screen. Deal canceled, funds frozen, investors fleeing. Each alert was a nail in the coffin she had built for herself with arrogance and cruelty. And through it all, Evelyn Carter stood composed, radiant even with crimson wine staining her gown, the embodiment of a truth that every guest would carry with them long after the night ended. Power does not beg. Power does not shout. Power decides. And tonight, power had just spoken. The aftershock of Evelyn Carter's words rippled through the Skyline Tower ballroom like an earthquake. What had once been Madison Steele's glittering stage was now a graveyard of loyalty. At first, the shift was subtle. One of Madison's closest friends, a hedge fund wife who had cackled loudest at Evelyn's earlier humiliation, slid her chair a few inches back as if to physically distance herself from the woman in gold. Another ally busied herself with her phone, pretending she hadn't been part of the jeering chorus. Then the movement spread. The waitstaff, who had stood frozen when Madison commanded security, now realigned instinctively. A server approached Evelyn's table, bowing slightly before setting down a fresh glass of water with quiet reverence. Another gathered empty flutes from Madison's table, his eyes lowered, his silence an act of refusal. Whispers rolled through the room, sharp and urgent. "She owns the building. She controls the deal. She just erased $4.9 billion with a sentence." Madison tried to laugh, the sound brittle, hollow. "Come on," she said, glancing wildly at her circle of friends. "This is ridiculous. Tell her she's bluffing. Tell her." But her chorus was gone. The women who had once mirrored her cruel laughter now stared into their glasses, cheeks flushed with shame. The men who had clapped at her insults now checked stock alerts, calculating what Evelyn's announcement meant for their portfolios. Step by step, metaphorically and literally, they abandoned her. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth leaned back in his chair, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "Loyalty built on intimidation," he murmured to his wife, "crumbles the moment fear changes sides." At her corner, Jordan Reyes whispered into her recorder. "Allegiance is shifting. The crowd is defecting in real time. Madison's empire wasn't built on respect. It was built on fear, and fear is fickle." The once glittering golden figure at the center of the gala now stood alone, a queen without a court. And Evelyn Carter, standing calm and composed, had not raised her voice once. The ballroom's golden light caught on the deep crimson blotch that spread across Evelyn Carter's indigo gown. What Madison Steele had meant as a stain of shame no longer looked like humiliation. It looked like a crest, a banner, a medal earned in battle. Guests couldn't stop staring. The dark bloom of wine shimmered under the chandeliers, refusing to hide, refusing to fade. It marked Evelyn not as a victim, but as a survivor. Unbroken, dignified, untouchable. For Evelyn herself, it was deliberate. She hadn't blotted at the spill beyond the napkin she'd placed with surgical calm. She let it remain visible, a testament, a line in the sand, evidence that cruelty had been tried and cruelty had failed. A woman in sequins, who only minutes ago had whispered derision, now leaned toward her husband and murmured, "She wears it like armor." The man nodded mutely, adjusting his cufflinks with the quiet air of someone trying to disguise unease with admiration. Across the floor, Madison Steele caught the stares. She saw how eyes lingered not on her shimmering gold, but on Evelyn's indigo wine-stained gown. Fury flared in her chest. "Don't look at her," she snapped under her breath, but her voice carried farther than she intended. Heads turned sharply and more than one guest looked away from her in disgust. At her corner, Jordan Reyes's pen scratched across her notepad, her voice hushed and awed into her recorder. The wine stain is no longer ridicule, it's rebirth. Madison tried to weaponize humiliation, but Evelyn turned it into a symbol of endurance. The room sees it. They can't unsee it. Richard Hollingsworth adjusted his posture, lifting his glass in a subtle salute toward Evelyn. "That's not a stain," he muttered. "That's a flag." And she just planted it in Madison's chest. The tide had fully turned. The wine stain meant to diminish had instead exalted. It was no longer proof of mockery. It was proof of survival, a reminder that dignity does not vanish under assault. And every eye in the ballroom now understood. Evelyn Carter hadn't just endured the attack. She had claimed it. Madison Steele's bravado finally crumbled. The golden glow of her dress no longer dazzled. It clung to her like a gaudy costume, a parody of power. Her hands shook as she clutched her phone, her screen still flashing with urgent alerts of termination, collapse, and retreat. Her voice, once sharp and cruel, broke into something smaller, fragile. "Please," she whispered at first, then louder, desperation cracking through the brittle veneer. "Please, Evelyn, this was all... It was a joke. It went too far. We can talk about this. We can fix this." The words hung in the air, pitiful echoes of someone who only minutes ago had commanded the room with ridicule. The crowd shifted again, this time not in discomfort but in judgment. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed. A few guests folded their arms, unimpressed by Madison's sudden transformation. She was no longer predator. She was cornered prey, begging the lion she had provoked not to strike. Evelyn Carter remained perfectly still. Her face carried no malice, no smile, no satisfaction. Only the serenity of inevitability. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, and absolute. "No." The single syllable sliced sharper than any insult Madison had ever hurled. It was not loud, but it was final. The kind of no that closed doors forever, that shattered illusions, that left no ground to stand on. Madison flinched as if struck. She tried again, her words tumbling over each other. "You don't understand. I didn't mean..." But Evelyn raised her hand, palm up, and the words died in Madison's throat. At her corner, Jordan Reyes whispered into her recorder, Madison Steele begging. Evelyn Carter answers with a single word. The room is witnessing the anatomy of collapse. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth's voice was low but certain. "That's it. She's finished." The moment Evelyn spoke that word, Madison ceased to matter. Around them, silence fell heavier than ever before. Not because Evelyn demanded it, but because the crowd no longer cared to hear Madison's voice. She had begged, she had been denied, and the verdict was sealed. Evelyn Carter rose fully now, her indigo gown trailing like midnight silk across the marble floor. The crimson stain, far from hidden, gleamed under the chandeliers as if it were a badge of war. Her posture was unyielding, her steps measured, every movement a masterclass in poise. The ballroom reacted instinctively. The crowd parted without a word, a living tide pulling back as though compelled by something greater than etiquette. No one dared block her path. No one dared speak. Even the security guards, who only moments earlier had been summoned to remove her, stepped aside, their heads slightly bowed. Each click of Evelyn's heels echoed louder than the jazz band's muted notes, louder than Madison Steele's entire performance had all evening. The sound was steady, deliberate, like a verdict being written in stone. Madison stumbled after her, her voice breaking, shrill and panicked. "Wait! Please, Evelyn! We can work something out!" But the words fell flat. No one answered. No one even looked at her. Eyes tracked Evelyn instead, reverent, cautious, awed. Guests who had mocked her minutes earlier now stood straighter, as if they might somehow realign themselves with the gravity of her presence. Even the host, William Bradford III, remained rooted at his table, sweat glistening on his brow, unable to muster a word. At her corner, Jordan Reyes whispered, barely containing the tremor in her voice. "The Queen is leaving on her own terms. The crowd isn't escorting her out. They're escorting her through. This isn't an exit. This is a coronation." Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth raised his glass once more. His voice was calm, resonant. "That is dignity," he declared. "It doesn't need applause. It commands silence." Evelyn did not turn, did not acknowledge the desperate pleas behind her. Her face was serene, her stride unhurried, as if the entire spectacle had been nothing more than another line in a ledger, balanced and closed. And with every step she took, the truth crystallized for everyone in the room. Evelyn Carter did not merely belong in the Skyline Tower ballroom. She owned it. The doors had not yet closed behind Evelyn Carter, but the judgment she left in her wake was already etched into every corner of the Skyline Tower ballroom. The chandeliers still spilled golden light, the jazz quintet still played their muted notes, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. Guests whispered in urgent tones, their words fragments of panic and revelation. "She owns the merger. She canceled it. Just like that. She holds the building itself. 4.9 billion, gone in a sentence." Phones lit up the room like a constellation, screens glowing as brokers, lawyers, and assistants were summoned into midnight crisis. Deals that seemed untouchable an hour ago now felt like glass shattering underfoot. At her corner table, Jordan Reyes sat frozen, her recorder still running, but her hands shaking. She whispered into it, half in awe, half in disbelief. This wasn't just a social scene. This was history. A woman walked into a room designed to erase her, and instead she erased the arrogance that built it. Across the room, Richard Hollingsworth watched the tremors ripple through the elite. His lips curved into something between respect and grim satisfaction. "Tonight wasn't about billions," he said softly to his wife. "It was about correction. The correction arrogance always fears, but never expects." Meanwhile, Madison Steele stood abandoned in the center of it all, her golden dress dulled, her phone buzzing endlessly with the collapse of everything she thought she controlled. She turned from one guest to another, desperate for an ally, but each pair of eyes slipped away. Each step took people farther from her. She was no longer the star of the gala. She was its cautionary tale. Even the waitstaff carried themselves differently now, their service subtly reoriented toward Evelyn's legacy rather than Madison's illusion. The act of clearing glasses, of pouring water, had become silent gestures of where power now resided. The verdict was clear. Evelyn Carter had entered the ballroom mocked as an outsider. She left it as its sovereign, and Madison Steele, stripped of her borrowed radiance, remained alone in the rubble of her own arrogance. Outside the Skyline Tower, the New York night glittered with its own silent judgment. Yellow cabs streamed down Fifth Avenue, horns echoing faintly against the steel and glass canyons of the city. High above, in the quiet leather interior of her waiting car, Evelyn Carter finally allowed herself to exhale. The limousine door closed with a soft, decisive thud, sealing her away from the ballroom she had just conquered. For a moment, she sat in silence, gazing out at the lights of Manhattan, the city that had so often tried to silence her, and tonight had been forced to bow. Her fingers brushed lightly against the indigo silk of her gown. The crimson stain, still vivid against the fabric, no longer felt like an attack. It was a reminder, a mark of every humiliation she had endured, every door slammed in her face, every voice that had told her she did not belong. And yet here she was, not only present, but sovereign. Her mind drifted back to that night decades ago, standing in the cold rain outside a Harvard gala, the doorman's sneer burning like acid in her chest. Not for people like you. She remembered the long walk back to her dorm, soaked and humiliated, whispering a promise into the night. I will build power so deep, so undeniable, that no one will ever have the right to tell me I don't belong again. Tonight, that promise had been fulfilled, not by shouting, not by demanding space, but by constructing power brick by brick, deal by deal, until the very rooms that sought to erase her could not exist without her. Back in the ballroom, they would still be whispering her name. Carter. Investors would be recalculating. Lawyers would be scrambling. Madison Steele's empire was already in freefall, reduced from glittering spectacle to smoldering cautionary tale in the span of an hour. But Evelyn Carter felt no triumph, no glee, only a steady, resolute sadness that it had required such a display. Quiet power does not gloat, it simply acts, then moves on. The car began its glide down the avenue, the city lights rushing up to greet her as if they belonged to her too. She rested her hands lightly in her lap, her posture unshaken, her gaze steady. She had not shouted for space in that room. She had not begged to belong. She had simply proven, with quiet precision, that the room itself belonged to her, and now it always would.